again, tonight, we pick up this unfolding drama about Absalom and his attempt at a coup to overthrow his father David's throne, take charge. He's a young, extremely ambitious,
17.
very vain, hard-driven, you know, he's got a goal and he's going for it. But I think as we see, you know, remember the old saying, you know, man proposes, but God disposes? And that's what we'll see here. Everything on paper looked like it was straightforward and a done deal. But that's without the God factor. And now the God will be guiding, and we'll see how he turns the tables, even when it looked like it was a slam dunk for Absalom and company. So let's pray, and then we'll pick it up in chapter 17. Would someone just like to lead us in a word of opening prayer? Let's go with blessing on the time together.
We're not that astute.
That's fine, I don't mean to embarrass if we shall be. Father, we're here tonight because we really want to hear from heaven as you speak through your word, and as we interact with it individually and put our sense of what it means on it, that you will give us the freedom to speak and to share and to open our hearts as well to hear. So guide and bless this evening. We pray the Holy Spirit would have his way as we gather as a group of men wanting to serve you, live for you. So we commit the time now in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Chapter 17. So let's read verses 1 through 14. Whomever would like to tackle that. Not too many strange names.
No,
Larry?
Yeah, I'll start it. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he was weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean return of all. All people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men, they are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who followed Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you. And with you yourself leading them into battle, then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not even a piece of it can be found. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel. For the Lord hath determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom.
So here we see, you know, the plan is sort of unfolding, and yet God is at work in the background. What do you think motivated Ahithophel, and how did he perceive the king and what was happening. What do you think was driving him to be a part of this coup?
Well, he had an axe to grind with King David. Apparently he was, what's her name's,
Bathsheba?
Yeah, Bathsheba. He was Bathsheba's grandfather. So apparently he felt that his family had been slighted.
Mm. To me, it's interesting how laissez-faire he is in talking about it. How does he see David?
Vulnerable.
Pardon?
Vulnerable?
Vulnerable, yeah. What else?
No longer the king.
Yeah, it's interesting, he really, he's changed allegiance from David, and he switched it over to Absalom. And you kind of wonder why. And there could be a family thing in the background,
Also could be pride.
pride.
Because later on it goes, it sounds like Ahithophel is a very proud person.
And Ahithophel, here, he mentions the king 5 times, but it's almost like, and who is the king at this point?
David.
David. And who is David now? In God's system?
You know, the chosen one.
The chosen one, he's the anointed. And God had handpicked David to be, leader of Israel. And he's just sort of casually dismissing all that. Do you ever see this being played out in Christian circles, in the church?
Sounds like politics.
It plays out everywhere.
Well, I think, I'm not saying that the pastor is equal to God's anointed, but sometimes, church leaders who are chosen to be, because it's felt that they have the character and the qualifications and the experience, like ministry experience, to be a part of the leadership. But it's easy, over the years, I've been amazed at how casually sometimes people in the pews can criticize church leaders. Oh, what an idiot, what does this guy think, what is she or he doing, And I'm not saying we shouldn't critically look, at leaders. And I think, I'm not saying they're above suspicion or above, that they should never be criticized or critiqued. But I've had to hold my mouth at times and put myself in check, because I think it's easy just to forget that, how does God see their role? In the New Testament, in Paul's letter to Timothy and to Titus, he talks about being careful, and James talks about also being careful how you see church leaders. And so I think we're in a very enviable position where we've got wonderful leadership, and Father Joe and with Esther, and so many people leading the ministry. So I've seen this played out, this kind of dynamic of just dismissing the God factor, and just looking at people in all their frailty and humanness, but just sort of dismissing them casually, like, all the bunch of idiots who run this church. And, we need to be careful. I'm not rebuking you, I'm just saying, it's not just a historical problem, it can happen, in our midst as well. And so, what do you think of Ahithophel's plan? Do you think, how sound strategically do you feel it is?
It was excellent. Positively excellent.
What's the advantages of his plan versus Hushai's?
I think it would minimize relatively innocent people being killed. He'd just go after David, but he'd do it quickly before David get the hang of things.
It does sound good on paper. Low impact, not a lot of people get hurt, you just sneak in, grab babies, get out, no harm, no foul. But it doesn't work.
And the US military has tried that over and over and over again. And it's not always so easy. I'm just reading a thing about, the attack to get a hold of, to kill,
Sana?
some of them, you know. On paper, everything looked fine. 2 helicopters, they come in and bang, bang, it's all done. What happens? One helicopter crashes, everything goes out the window, you know. They get lost in the house, everything that could have gone wrong probably went wrong. Big noise and ruckus, and what are the neighbors thinking and all this? Amazingly, they got him and got out, but, even the most carefully planned. things can go
Jimmy
wrong.
Carter had a problem, didn't he?
Yeah.
With Iran.
Oh, yeah, trying to get, all those,
Or the storm came about, the sandstorm.
I don't think bin Laden's neighbors really liked him. That's my gut
I don't
feel.
think they knew he was there, probably, yeah. But at any rate, so, Ahithophel had a good plan. But how did Hushai, how did he turn the advice? How did he turn it to, so that it was adopted basically by Absalom? What was his wild card that he played effectively?
Total wipeout. Wipe them out.
He knew David was a soldier, wasn't gonna be stupid.
Yeah.
But
His idea was, had some soundness to it also.
But they sort of puzzling that they didn't recognize David as the king and having a real connection with God in this whole thing.
I know.
And they're just sort of ignoring that whole thing.
Exactly.
But I think the thing is, what's his name? Hushai or whatever? He was a friend of David. So it's almost when you go back to the previous chapter, so Absalom is getting counsel from Ahithophel or whatever his name is, okay? And he's like I wouldn't say yes man, but he's like kind of edging Absalom on. So, Hushai or whatever, Hushai or whatever.
Depending on all this-
So he's kind of like, playing up Absalom, so that Absalom is now asking for his advice, and he's basically giving him advice that's counter to Ahithophel, right? So it's interesting how, if Absalom thought that Ahithophel's counsel was the best thing since sliced bread, why would he even ask the other guy,
Yeah. But he wanted his advice, and I think, an important key to the change here in Absalom's decision to go with Hushai rather than
Yeah, right.
Ahithophel. Look at verse 11, and read that verse over. Someone read it, please.
Sure. But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba, like the sand by the sea for the multitude, and that you go to battle in person.
Yeah, interesting, yeah, my NIV says, and be gathered with you yourself, leading them into battle. So what was the wild card he was playing here?
He wanted the whole population.
Yeah. But where did he put
He wanted Absalom as king in an
Yeah.
obvious position.
Yeah, I think he was appealing to Absalom's vanity.
Yeah, right.
Show him
You're
your
the
leader.
king, get out front on a white horse, And of course, that was the role typically kings went into battle along with their armies, unlike nowadays. And I think that was part of it. He proposed the ultimate flattery that, Absalom would lead the troops into battle, because that's what kings usually did.
But if you think, I'm saying, if you're from David's perspective, and okay, rather than getting something happening behind the scenes and kind of covertly, with Absalom out in front, it's pretty clear that somebody's going, you know what I'm saying? It kind of forces the issue.
Yeah. So, obviously, Hushai's advice did make sense at one level, and yet, in the end, even the narrator admits that Ahithophel's plan was probably the better plan. But what was the factor that neither Ahithophel or Absalom counted on this at the end of verse 14?
Well, the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom.
And that's the God factor, that's where they weren't looking at God's will or purpose and all of this, they were looking at it purely humanly. had determined to bring disaster on Absalom. Why was God going to bring disaster on Absalom?
Because he told David that his people would die, his family would die, his sons, for, the affair with Bathsheba.
Wait a minute, are you saying
He brought,
he was gonna bring disaster on Ahithophel?
no,
On Absalom.
on Absalom, because didn't it was told to David, or when David said, I guess, was it Nathaniel?
Nathan.
Nathan. Nathan, he told, would give him the story,
Yeah.
and David said, well, this man should, be killed and have, 4 times happen to him what happened to the guy that, to him.
Yeah,
So this is, I guess, maybe the first of, or the second of, no, he lost a son before that, right, Absalom, Amnon, so that was, he would be
and
the
the baby with Bathsheba, now this is the third.
third,
Fourth.
okay, the baby, okay, so, yeah.
But Absalom, was he worthy of punishment at this point?
Yes, treason.
Yeah, treason. And besides that, he was also a murderer,
Okay.
unfortunately.
He killed his brother.
He killed his brother. And,
And he's with David's concubine.
exactly, and has slept with them in public view. So here was a man who was he doesn't deserve a lot of our sympathy at this point in light of what he's done. Okay, and I think it's, there's an interesting verse in the book of Romans. It talks to us about, when we receive criticism or abuse, I'm not talking about sexual abuse, but I mean, when we're misused and mishandled, and or injustices come to us, it says, don't turn around and seek to, don't seek revenge. And then this principle, for vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And that's what we're seeing played out here. God's vengeance on a lawbreaker, on a serious criminal offense. And the fact that he slept with David's concubines, what in effect, we mentioned this last week, what in effect was that symbolizing? When he went into the public view,
David and Bathsheba.
Not David, but David's concubines.
Right.
Absalom came in and.
There's now what David did with Bathsheba, he
He
slept
did,
with her.
he did.
The concubines were royal property, and he slept with them, that was showing his authority.
Yeah.
He-
It was
Okay,
basically,
okay,
his
okay, yeah,
statement
yeah.
saying, I'm king now, that's
Yeah.
what kings do, they inherit the harem. Okay, good, so
Always good to be the king.
he broke, yeah,
Or not.
he broke the Mosaic law, he broke,
Civil law.
to gain power, civil power, he broke God's laws. And, so, disaster was due. So, let's read on then, in verses 15 to 29, the next section.
Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I had advised them to do so and so. Now send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En Rogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom came to the woman at the house, they asked, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman answered them, they crossed over the brook. The men searched, but found no one. So they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, "Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you." So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. Wow.
Go ahead, you can finish it out.
Oh, you want me to keep going? I'm sorry, Absalom's dead. David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash, from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Amiel, from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gideonite from Roglem. Fine job.
Fine job.
Brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese, honey curds, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. But they said the people have become exhausted and hungry and thirsty in the wilderness.
Yeah, right?
Wow.
Good job.
What struck you as we see this story continue? What did you pick up or?
It looks like everybody's related, besides having tough names, they're all cousins to each other.
Yeah.
And also that Joab lost his job as general, so now he returns to David, so there's like courtroom intrigue here, and everybody's getting their noses out of joint.
And Ahithophel also, as a result of that, he committed suicide.
Why do you think he committed suicide? We're not sure if it was the same night, or it says he went to his hometown. It could have been, we don't know how much later it was, but he saw obviously the handwriting on the wall. And,
I think that any trust that he had from Absalom, of Absalom accepting advice from him, had ended.
Yeah, I think so. Do you think he may have also sensed that by going this route, David was going to get away? And in the end, David
Would
get
get
there,
him anyway, yeah.
and he would be on the chopping block. So he decided, I better finish it off now rather than
Right.
waiting.
You've read the longer story, I haven't got there yet.
I'm thinking Ahithophel probably felt he had control over Absalom, and then when Absalom followed the advice of another prophet, he realized that he was not even number two anymore.
My translation here has a brief comment saying there's no stigma associated with suicide in the Bible.
It never says, as some church denominations say, that it's the ultimate cardinal sin. It never says that. I mean, there's some logical reasons to think that it's normally not acceptable and would please God. But anyway, that's a whole different can of worms. As a student minister, I'm sure you know. All right, so at any rate, so Hushai sends off these two spies, two messengers, to get word back to David as to what's gonna unfold. And how does David respond to this?
He takes their advice.
Yeah, and so verse 23 says, so David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan River, and because they felt if they didn't get far enough away, things would they would get trapped, and it would be the end. So it says David went to Mahanaim, and this, we're not exactly sure where this is, but it looks looks like it was on the other side of the Jordan River, in the Transjordan, probably, that was Ishbosheth's capital city, and I think David probably went there because the inhabitants of that town were grateful for him. Remember Mephibosheth was Saul's grandson, Jonathan's, son, and who was crippled, and he brought him into his home and took care of him. And so that was his family home, this Mahanaim, and I think David felt like he had a safe place there that he could go to and hang out until things changed. But at any rate, remember Joab and Amasa. Amasa will come back in the next chapter, but both of these were nephews of David, and Absalom's cousin. So, anyway, so Amasa took Joab's place as commander of Israel's troops. Isn't it interesting here, you see this, I think this account, this story sort of, I think, illustrates how divine sovereignty and human agency sometimes work together in outworking the purpose of God. So, I mean, God could have just put a bolt of light and zapped Absalom, brought it to a hole. But he lets all these other circumstances unfold, and David's protected, but in the end, God brings to naught Absalom's plot, as we'll see in the next chapter. What's also, I think, amazing is to see the end of this in verse 27, and verse down to 29. This man named Barzillai shows up, and he's a wealthy supporter of David from a town that's further north. And but he initiates help for David. And what does he do? What does he supply him with? Everything he needs.
Bedding, bowls, pottery, food, milk.
So isn't it interesting here, God is delivering David and taking care of David. But what does he use? He uses people, friends, connections, and just like he does today. I mean, we're the hands of Christ, we're here, and God works through human agencies. Occasionally he'll just come in the middle without any assistance, but normally he works through people to achieve his purpose. But what I love here is in the midst of a revolution, a coup, an attempted coup. His life is on the line. It's life or death. He's just living life on the razor edge again, just like he did when King Saul was chasing him around the desert. But in the middle of that, you can read this incredible scene of God bringing supplies and provisions. And I wonder if David, when he saw this, thought back to a psalm he wrote, a very famous psalm that I think all of us, if we started it, we would quote together. The Lord is my
Shepherd, I shall not want.
And towards the end of it says, and you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Isn't that a lovely picture of that?
Yes.
Yep.
God providing a table for David in the presence of his enemies, surrounded by him. And that's, I mean, David is undergoing God's divine discipline. And it's not an easy path, but it's something he started, and the discipline is forthcoming. At the same time, we see God's gracious deliverance, because he could have punished David because of murder and adultery. He could have disqualified him just like Saul had removed him, but he didn't. He said, commitment I've made to you, the covenant I've made to you will keep going forever, and eventually it was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But here we see him keeping that promise, and keeping David alive, and providing for him. And I don't know, do you find this sort of encouraging, though, even at times when you might, I'm sure it never happened to you, but when you might mess up and you feel like you're totally a bunch of junk or unworthy of anything, and then just God graciously spread the table, bring something unexpected, blessing, provision in some way, and remind you that his love is absolutely unconditional.
But you also have to repent.
Yeah.
You have to admit your shortcomings, and then just dilly-dally, keep on going down the road. I don't think God's gonna
That was,
take that too
time
kindly.
over, that was Saul, he
Yeah.
could never really own up to his error.
Shortcomings.
But David did, he just, he really knew of the terrible thing he'd done. But he's suffering the consequences of it, the fallout, but God, in the midst of all this, is graciously guiding, providing, protecting. All right, let's see what happens to good old Absalom. Will he get his due, chapter 18, all right?
See what the Holy Spirit does in this guy.
So would someone, verses 1 through 5, there's only a couple of difficult words, so somebody need to try, give it a shot, 1 through 5.
Then David mustered the men who were with him, and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, and the son of Zariah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, and while the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands, and the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom.
How do you see David at this point? What's his sort of posture or demeanor at this point?
Well, I think he's getting back up. It's hard not to be king,
Yeah, right.
but he is also, in his heart, has pity for his son, as he tells him. Yeah.
But it's sort of like he's finally being kingly. He's taking charge. He's doing what he does best. It's general, David, you know. He's commanded armies in the past many, many times, won many battles. He was sort of like, he sort of woke up from a sleep and said, I think I'm supposed to be king. And so he's large and in charge.
It's interesting though how they're going out for battle, literally. And he's telling them, be gentle on my son. I mean, that's like,
Yeah,
what is
we're
that,
gonna-
what is
we're
that
gonna-
supposed to mean?
Yeah, we're gonna
In
pick
battle.
up on that because that's a real problem.
Yeah, that's like a wink.
And he determined he'd lead his troops, right? And his troops didn't think it was a good idea. Why was that?
Because he might get killed.
And if he got killed, that was the end of
Israel.
the play, isn't it? Well, and then Absalom would be the
Right, well, Israel.
in charge, yeah. A lot of, so he agreed to stay behind. But then, do you think he put his leaders, his officers and troops in a difficult position by this sort of, by the way, as you go into combat, be nice to your enemy, be nice to my son,
To
deal
Absalom.
gently, the young man.
Notice how well Joab listened.
But isn't it relative? Deal gently with, it may simply mean don't take his head off, but you can tie him up in chains.
Be merciful. Or if you were gonna kill him quickly. Well, I mean, I don't know,
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
take this in many ways.
Yeah, no,
what he's
no, I
saying.
hear you, yeah. But in a way, do you think here at this point, he's acting more like a king, a leader, a general, or as like a father?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think he should have been acting as a father at this point?
No, he's time to be a military leader.
I mean, what had Absalom done? What kind of a situation had he created because of his ambition?
Pretty much a civil war
With the implication of what?
of taking over for his father,
Yeah.
kicking his father out, overthrowing his father.
And the loss of life,
Yeah.
thousands, the unsettling of Israel's economy, and welfare and so forth. I mean, it was, in a sense, the truth was that we can all empathize with David's heart for his son, but his son at this point, he needed to see him as someone who's rebelled against God's order. And it wasn't some kind of like domestic quarrel, you know, that could be put right with an apology and a handshake. And so he failed, I think, to see Absalom as a traitor and a rebel whose actions, you know, had and would cause a great deal of harm to the stability and welfare of God's people. So this wasn't something minor that he could kind of sweep under the table. And the potential loss of life. So he says, be gentle with the young man. What was he implying with this?
He's still innocent in his eyes. He's still maturing.
Yeah, he's inexperienced.
He's inexperienced.
And he was, Absalom was in his twenties probably, or maybe a little older. I mean, he wasn't a teenager by any means, and he'd been around the block. And so here, he's much later than in his early twenties, but that was when he killed Amnon, his brother. But it's interesting that, in effect, Absalom's youth is no excuse. Relative youth is no excuse for his behavior, for what he's done, and he's doing, the mirror readers trying to use it. It's interesting that the writer Samuel uses the same term, young man, for Eli's son. Remember Eli, when we started way back in 1 Samuel, and the priest? And he describes those sons. He said, the sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight. And these guys were in their 40s. They were in their 40s, so it wasn't like, he's talking about a teenager. And so youth here is not a valid excuse for what he's doing and needs to be. But there's also something that jumps out in verse 6. Would someone read that? We haven't gone on to.
The army marched.
Let's read 6 through 18. Let's read the next section.
The army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There the army of Israel was defeated by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. When one of the men saw this, he told Joab, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Joab said to the man who had told him, what? You saw him. Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt. But the man replied, even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, excuse me, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I had put my life in jeopardy, and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. Joab said, I'm not going to wait like this for you. So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. He named the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day.
Who says the Old Testament isn't exciting to read? Yeah. Okay.
Don't you get the sense that it's almost like a reverse Judas?
Yeah.
I mean, Judas took the silver and hung himself. This guy hung himself, and the guy's saying, you should have taken the silver, and he didn't, and he didn't take it, so it's,
Interesting comparison, yeah.
the other thing is, how good of a ride, I mean, you don't get the sense that mules are
That fast.
that fast that you think you
You
can
don't
dodge
see
an
the
oak
tree
tree.
coming down.
Well, it's talking about this forest, and we're not exactly, scholars aren't quite sure where it is. Somewhere outside of the Jordan River, east side. But obviously, you've been in thick, I mean, you go into, just off the trail anywhere in Connecticut.
Yeah, right.
This stuff you could hardly fight your way through. Well, it was the worst kind of battleground that you could pick for, you know. And it says a lot of casualties came just dealing with the woods. But at any rate, notice verse 6, there's something that, it's tragic when you read it. I don't want you to miss it. Someone read just verse 6 again.
Oh, the army went to the field to fight Israel. I thought that was tragic.
The army went to fight Israel. And this turned into internecine warfare. Before Israel was the enemy against the Philistines or Ammonites or, you know, Midianites and others, but now all of a sudden, they become the target. And,
Well, and this is the interesting with the contrast. If you think of like, you know, when David, he was actually anointed while Saul was still king, right? But he was anointed by God, and he was like the heir apparent. And meanwhile, they were all fighting against the Philistines, right? So here you now have really what's kind of a civil war, and Absalom's he's not anointed by anybody, maybe by himself, but
Self-anointed, yeah.
self-anointed type of thing,
I'm kidding.
right?
So,
This reminds me a lot of Samson.
mhm.
His hair was his downfall.
Yeah.
He got tangled up in the trees. That's basically was it.
When it says the casualties that day were great, it's kind of a, remember when Eli and his sons, when Eli's sons, they were attacked by the Philistines, and they took the ark and they went out to fight them. And what was the outcome of that battle? This is way back in First Samuel.
Yeah, it was a wipeout.
They were totally defeated, and they lost the ark. You know, and this is a parallel. I mean, there was a tremendous loss of life, all because of one man's ambition. Absolutely. So, it says here that his head or his hair literally got caught in the tree, in an overhanging branch. And, anyway, it was just an inanimate object, the tree, but it became Absalom's downfall. Do you remember what he was very proud of, Absalom?
Oh, it's there.
Remember, he's described as having these glowing, long locks, blonde hair or something. You would think
He's like a rock
similar
star.
to have
Yeah,
blonde
like
hair,
a-
but anyway, and he would cut it off and, you know, in a way considerable, in other words, he was so proud, he preened and all the rest, but here's his hair becomes his very, the means by which he met his downfall. And there's a verse in Proverbs, Proverbs 14:26. I'm not asking you to quote it. It says, pride goes before a fall. And here you see the downfall. And the question was raised, why in the world was he on a mule? And yet, the mule was considered a royal mount. I mean, it was what they rode on in situations. And so it says he was pulled off of his mule. And what's the significance of that?
Oh, yeah.
What does that sort of symbolically say?
Long on a royal mount.
Yeah, no mule, no king. You lose your mule, you lose your status as king. No mule, no kingdom. And it's an interesting kind of statement that he got what he deserved, tragically.
The last verse, it said that he had no children, no son. I thought earlier we read that he had He had children when he was
He had-
starting
He had
off.
3 kids, which seems to indicate what?
They fought over the inheritance and killed each other?
Well, they died prematurely or somehow, none were living. And isn't it, here he was trying to build a kingdom for himself, a name for himself. And nobody's there to do it. Normally, a son would build a monument in memory of a father, a ruler, somebody who'd done something important. And we like to memorialize our parents, don't we, appropriately. But he had no one to do that, so he built his own little monument and, just outside of Jerusalem.
Could this be a precursor to the split, you know, like David had kind of united Israel, right? And, or all the tribes, okay? And then shortly thereafter, they split between the north and the south. And when they called, he said they went against the army of Israel, yet it was the servants of David. I mean, I think of like like David really being the Judea and a few of the tribes down there. I mean, the word Israel means like something of God, and it's the God of El, which is not the Israeli God, it's the God from the north. So maybe this is kind of a precursor where the Civil War was between the northern, precursor of what was gonna happen down the road.
And we'll see this as we finish up reading through the rest of 2 Samuel. There'll be this constant tension between the northern kingdom, Benjamin, and other, and beyond, and Manasseh and the other tribes of the north, and Judah, and Simeon was folded into Judah at this point. So here you have the north and the south, and you'll see tensions of this coming up in the next, and it continues, and then finally the split comes under King Solomon at his death.
Well, this is like a countdown to Solomon.
Yeah, it is.
Because these are potential heirs to David, and they're kind of like saying, okay, Amnon's out of the thing, this guy is now gonna get out of it. Then, you know, the best choice is gonna be Solomon, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if David got the full story of how his son died, though. I mean, even though he was told to be gentle, you think he could have just cut his hair, let him drop, give him a sword and say, come here,
Yeah.
and pop him. He just,
Don't know.
yeah, that would be,
It's interesting.
This
Let's-
Joab.
Let's look at this. I mean, it's interesting. You have Joab, who's got a trigger finger, and then there's this other soldier who first sees Absalom hanging there. Quite a picture. He's just hanging, with his feet not touching the ground, obviously. And must have been very uncomfortable. And he reports this to Joab. He said, by the way, guess who I saw? And so Joab says, why in the world
Just
did
hanging
you
out.
kill him? And what was
Just hanging out.
the soldier's defense? What was he?
Not enough money in the world.
Yeah, why? Yes.
Because the
they respect him.
king's retribution, you know,
Yeah, because he said this was clearly the king's order to deal gently with Absalom.
The guy was probably right.
Yeah, right, he said deal gently, right?
That was the king's order at that time, whether it was appropriate or not, or wise, we already talked.
Should leave him hanging for 10 days until he finally dies, right?
Yeah, I guess that's.
Yeah.
If it's just Bob the soldier, he's gonna get in trouble, but Joab can
But
pull it off.
Joab goes after him, he doesn't hesitate. What do you think was Joab's motive in killing Absalom at this point?
Protect David.
He knew better than David what war was really like. He certainly is usurping David's authority, overriding it.
Yeah. I think maybe there was a sense of, he knew that if David spared Absalom, that might not be the end of Absalom.
Right.
And his ambition, that it could come back to haunt him later on, and he could stir up trouble and become a real threat to Israel, and to the Davidic kingdom later on. And he says, he's already shown himself as a tyrant, as a rebel, as a, a threat. I want to get rid of him, even at risking David's wrath. He probably at this point saw better, more clearly, the threat that Absalom was to David. So where did, what happened to Absalom's body at this point?
Buried in a pile of rocks.
Think that was a fitting end? What's interesting, obviously, he dies without honor here. It's just buried under a pile of rocks.
I think Joab wanted to hide the evidence too. He didn't want to see this guy with 37 stab wounds.
I mean, I look at the other way. The fact that they put him under, I mean, they could have, the fact they put him under rocks would prevent animals and stuff from getting at the body, right? I mean, if they had just really wanted things, they just would have left him out in the open.
It certainly does preclude that there's somebody else finding him and.
Yeah, exactly.
making a martyr out of him. and saying,
Exactly.
Yeah,
You know, to honor his dead body
that's a good point.
on the whole.
And it's interesting, I'm trying to find the verse, there's in the Mosaic Law, hold on here.
Oh yeah, cursed is one who's dies in a tree or something.
Well, yeah, there's that, but I don't know where it went. Anyway, but there was a Mosaic law saying that if someone, a son who's disobedient, and we're not talking about a one-off, but we're talking about is a habitual disobedient son who dishonors his parents and the community, will be dealt with severely, will be stoned.
Oh,
Yeah.
And
Absalom was
what
stoned.
happened to him at this point? And then the rocks are piled on him. It's
Stoned.
symbolic of violating, God's law. So anyway, let's continue on with the story. In verse 19, let's read down through the end of it.
My turn?
Yeah.
Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and take the news to the king, as the Lord has vindicated him by delivering him from the hand of his enemies." "You are not the one to take the news today," Joab told him. "You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to a Cushite, "Go, tell the king what you have seen." The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he is alone, he must have good news." And the runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another runner, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it is." The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, my lord, the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like your young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, if I had only died instead of you. Absalom, my son, my son."
Sad end. But, just picking up a few things, why do you think Ahimaaz wanted to be the news teller and run and break the news to David? He seemed to be really insistent.
Well, Zadok's a prophet, he's a priest and a prophet. So Ahimaaz must also be like, priestly.
No, I think he was just a soldier.
Oh,
Whether it was an officer or not, I don't know.
This is a him as son of Zadok.
Yeah. But I think perhaps he thought, normally when someone would deliver good news, the first thing would be a reward of some kind. And that's what Joab said, do you think you're gonna get rewarded? This won't be good news to David. It'll be tragic news. And then he says, instead of you, I'm gonna send this Cushite. Now, why do you think he would pick a foreigner to do this?
In case David was mad and killed him. He was killing his army.
It could be, he thought he was more expendable, you know? Anyway, so he sends off this Cushite.
Because it has happened a few times earlier in the story that
Yeah, we've heard, yeah, but
somebody
back
come
in- yeah,
with
so
bad
it's
news.
after the death of Saul. So at any rate, off he goes, and when he comes, Joab told him, tell him everything that you have seen. Well, I assumed that he'd seen that Absalom was dead and buried under a pile of rocks. But they're both are being vague somewhat, and not wanting to come right out and say, Absalom's stone dead. Instead, they say, well, Israel, your armies have won a great victory. But,
I love his answer. At the end here, it says, the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you do you harm. Be like that young man.
yeah, so, here we see the tragic sort of conclusion of one other part of David's discipline. He lost Amnon, his son, he lost the baby, now he's losing Absalom. He's gonna lose one more later on. And that was a self-imposed, my punishment will be fourfold, four times. And so, here's the divine discipline, and it's harsh. At the same time, God protected and guiding and is loving and still will work out his purpose in and through David. And so I think, Absalom's attempt to usurp David's throne proves again that I think disobedience to God's covenant, has serious consequences. There's a verse over in, just quickly look at, someone reads 2 Thessalonians in the New Testament, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 5 through 10. 2 Thessalonians 2, 5 through, sorry,
5
2
through-
Thessalonians 1, 5 through 10.
1, 5, 2?
Chapter 1 of 2 Thessalonians, verses 5 through 10.
Okay, all this evidence that God's judgment is right, and as a result, you will be counted worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you are suffering. God is just. He will pay back trouble to those who trouble you, and give relief to you who are troubled, and to us as well. This will happen when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. He will punish those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. They will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord, from the majesty of his power, on the day he comes to be glorified in his holy people and to be marveled at among those who have believed. This includes you because you believed our testimony to you.
These are strong words. And I think God's point is to rebel, to disobey, to dishonor God brings ultimate consequences. That God is a just God, and He will pay back all that has been unjustly done against His people, just like David was the anointed king, and those who rebelled against Him suffered the consequences. And for God's people, we may not see it in our lifetime, but ultimately, as we read through Revelation, God in the end wins, and His justice will prevail and will put right all that has gone wrong. All right, so that's the end of Absalom, but that's not the end of David's challenges and troubles. We'll read on.
Why would this kid do all that running just to get to David and said, oh, I just saw a great confusion, I don't know what happened?
I guess he lost his courage by the time he got there. Well,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I saw a great disturbance of, gee, why do you run away?
original marathon.
Disturbance in force.
Yeah, right. He was thinking while he was running. Changed his
Are
mind.
we eventually gonna get to Revelations and maybe you can explain that?
Well, we went through Revelation.
Okay.
Can't throw it over. And I've got something for you to read. Yeah. That's thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is our weekly prayer.
Right.
And what does that mean? When God's kingdoms come, he will put everything to right. Injustices will be dealt with. God's order will be established. And, okay, any prayer requests in closing, anything special concern on your heart?
I have a praise. I felt lousy with this weekend. And today I went back to work and right now I feel pretty good. But on Sunday I was like a dead dog.
It's interesting, maybe others of you knew, I wrote to Father Joe a brief email about this coming weekend. Our family, it will be the dedication of the Sandy Hook Memorial Garden in Sandy Hook, near to the Sandy Hook school. But the lovely garden and so forth, it's a memorial to the victims of the 26 victims and their families. But some of our family are coming from out of town, and our daughter-in-law, some of her family. And I just asked if we would pray for this our time. Our daughter-in-law, her name is Joanne. She'll be one of the presenters. It'll be a by invitation only service initially in the morning. And so First Selectman David, Dan Rosenthal will be there, and Joanne will speak. And then Governor Ned Lamont will also be there and speak. I appreciate prayer for that time, for that park, maybe a place of peace and memorial, and a sanctity, a sanctuary for people to go and reflect and find some measure of comfort and healing. But, so I appreciate prayer for that. And he told me in an email, I said, would you pray for this and so forth. And he said, yeah. And I also said, yesterday I thought the service was great, and, it was good to see a number of people out. And correct me, David, if I got it wrong, but I think he said between last Wednesday and yesterday, he said something like 220-some people came through the door.
Okay.
So between last Wednesday morning, the Sunday services, is that about right, 220-something?
Usually.
Yeah. So that's very encouraging to see. I thought the 8 o'clock service was much better attended than, some of the.
It was quite an attendance.
There was a baptism. too.
Why
There was a baptism, yeah.
Not just the families.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, it seemed to me like everybody left town in September or something, in October. It's good to see you coming back. All right, so let's close in prayer. So, Bill, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Lord be with you.
So with you.
Lord Jesus, we just thank you again for this time together. Diving into your word, understanding